first of all, thank you very much for doing this. We really appreciate it. And to begin with, I just want to ask the question that I think is probably the most obvious one. When did you first realize that you were a talented writer, and when did it first occur to you that you might want to pursue writing for a career?
Well, I always wanted to be a writer since I was a kid. I think I first started writing in school when I was 10 or 11 or something like that. And I wasn't quite sure what kind of writer. I loved movies very much from the beginning. And I would have loved to write for movies or be part of movies. But in those days when I was growing up, there was little, if not shameful, if you want to be a real serious writer, you wrote novels or plays or poetry. And writing for movies meant going to Hollywood, and that meant kind of selling out.
Right.
So I never thought of that. And I started writing as a prose writer. When I was 18 or 19, I sold a short story to the New Yorker, and during the war, I wrote a lot of reporting pieces for them, and I was a prose writer, basically. And then after the war, I had a book published, mostly pieces from the New Yorker about the war. And on the basis of that, I got a contract to go to Hollywood.
Now, I'm going to jump back for 1 second and just ask you, I gather that it was during high school that you spent a year in France and then went off to Dartmouth, and you've said in other interviews that it was in those places that you sort of became politicized. Well,
yeah. I think I went to France for 6 months after high school. I graduated from high school in January. In those days, the high school I went to, Erasmus Hall, was so crowded that they did several shifts, and so they had a graduation in January and then in June. And I graduated in January and had 6 months before I went off to college. And my parents sent me off to France. Before that, I hadn't really been politicized in any kind of way. I was barely conscious of the Depression, and it wasn't until I got to, it was a very exciting time, 1936, and the Spanish War had not yet started, but there were sit-down strikes, and I fell in with some older English kids who were much more politicized than I was, much more left. And through them, I gradually began to develop some kind of half-assed social conscience.
So, after the war, I believe 1946, you come back and you joined the Communist Party.
Yep.
Why? And at that time also, did it occur to you that doing that might have some larger implications on your life?
Well, I never thought there'd be repercussions, particularly. I mean, there was a depression. Being a communist was not thought of. It may have been thought of not socially acceptable, particularly, but it was nothing you went to jail for being. And I was still under the apprehension, I suppose, that you could be rich and holy at the same time, and I saw no. It seemed a logical thing for me, particularly coming out of the Spanish War and the feeling about the Depression, and that capitalism had failed, and this seemed an alternative, and the ideas and the ideals were very important to me.
So, you mentioned a moment ago, you sort of referred to this, but I just wonder if you can confirm, Keep Your Head Down, this anthology of all of your work, that was very widely acclaimed, and that was what sort of caught Columbia's attention and led them to ask you to come out to Hollywood?
Yes, well, what it did, the book came out, it got very good reviews, and trying to remember, I had an agent, and then I think it was through the agent. I told the agent I would love to go to Hollywood, and that I got the job. basically.
And the job initially was 10 weeks at Columbia working with Robert Rossen, is that right?
That was it. Yeah.
And what did that entail? He was working on All the King's Men, right?
Well, he was working on All the King's Men. I went out, he had an idea of making a movie out of a Chekhov short story called The Grasshopper, I think it was. But as soon as I got out there, chucked that out the window and put me on All the King's Men. And I did very little, if no writing on it. I just sat and listened to him and learned a lot. You know, he was an experienced screenwriter and become a director also. And it was really a tutorial more than anything else for me.
So how, subsequent to that, did you wind up with a much better contract working for Harold Hecht and Burt Lancaster?
Well, my agent was Harold Hecht.
Okay.
And his prime actor was Burt Lancaster, who was really just kind of getting started. And they formed a company together, Hecht Lancaster, and they had a deal at Universal. And so he hired me, you know, for twice what I was getting for Rossen. I was getting $250 a week from Rossen. I got $500 from him, more money I'd ever seen. You know, the idea of making that much money was, and I went to work on.
And yet, you didn't stay out in Hollywood all that long, and so I wonder, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I read that it was December 1947, just a few months after you'd been out there, that you decided to go back to New York. So was that for personal or political reasons?
It was absolutely personal. I went out in August. I came back December to a marvelous, great big snowstorm, I remember. And but it was for personal reasons. I was married with children, and the marriage was breaking up. And that's the reason I came back. I loved it out there. I wanted to stay, but I felt I had to come back.
And so, around the time that you came back was when, and this would be almost exactly 65 years ago, when the House Un-American Activities Committee started their proceedings. And I just want to confirm something. You were never subpoenaed by them, were you, to appear before the committee? Were you?
I was.
Oh, you were?
That was much later.
Okay, so maybe we'll come back. But I guess prior to that, the first sign of trouble for you would have been the fact that your name appeared in red channels, right?
Well, actually, I think it was before that. Pretty much before that. The first inkling that I had that I was in any kind of trouble was I had gotten a call from an agent saying would I write what was then called an audition script, a pilot script, essentially, for an advertising agency. This was in the days live television when it first started, when the agencies also produced shows. Actually, this was, I think, Young and Rubicam, and would I write a script? And he told me what it was, and I wrote it. And I gave it to the agents to give to the agency. And he said, well, maybe you should put another name on it. And I said, why? And he said, well, I don't know, rumors, I heard you were on some kind of list, and maybe it's better to put another name on it. So I said, okay. Didn't mean a lot to me at that particular point. I needed the job. So that was, you know, the first time. I mean, it's a funny story attached to that. I turned in the script with the other person's name on, and the agency called and said he likes the script, the executive at the agency, and he wants to meet the writer to talk about changes. And I said, I can't go in as that other writer. There are people up there who know me as me. I can't do that. He said, you got to do it. And I said, I can't, I won't. And he got mad at me and hung up. And then he called back a little while later and said, he fixed it. He said, I told the executive I was getting rid of that first writer. He wasn't cooperative. And I'm getting another writer to do the changes. And I said, great, that's fine. Who'd you get? He said, you. And I said, what do you mean? He said, I'm sending Walter Bernstein up to do the changes. I said, why did you do that in the first place? And he got mad at me again. He said, no, do it. And I went up and met the executive, had to listen to him telling me what a shit the other writer was for ducking out. I did the changes, which were minimal, as I remember, and handed it in. He thanked me, he said very much, and he said, he should have gotten you in the first place. You're a much better writer than the other one. So that was my introduction.
Wow.
And it was kind of finalized a little later on. I was writing a show at CBS called Danger, half-hour kind of melodrama that Yul Brynner had started out by directing, and then he had left to do King and I, and Sidney Lumet had taken it up, and he was the director. And I'd been writing very happily for them. And I came in one day, and the producer, very, very nice, non-political man named Charles Russell, said to me, there's a problem here. Again, he said, you have to put another name on the script. I said, why? He said, I don't know. They just told me upstairs that I can't use you anymore. I'm not to tell you that, I'm just to say we're changing the direction of the show, or some kind of cockamamie excuse that they tell writers. And that's when I really knew I was blacklisted.
And just for the record, can you explain, in terms of actual documentation, the way that people at the studios and the networks knew not that they were not to hire certain people was there were publications, whether it was Red Channels or other things, and can you explain how that worked?
Well, there was always somebody at the studio or the network who was in charge of that, of the clearance and whether they can work. And they were always being told, for example, there was this grocer in Syracuse, New York, who had 2 or 3 supermarkets. He was a rabid anti-communist. And wherever he got his information, you know, there were organizations, or there were people who had set themselves up as experts, anti-communist experts, and they had lists of people who would sign things. And about that time, Red Channels came out. And if you were in Red Channels, you were automatically blacklisted unless you went and cleared yourself.
Who was putting out Red Channels? How would it get sent around?
I think Red Channels was put out by a couple of ex-FBI agents who published it, and they also published a newsletter. I think it was called Counterattack or something like that, in which they would print out things like CBS is using John Randolph and he's a communist and they shouldn't be doing it. And, you know, I was in Red Channels. There were about 8 listings. They were all true.
Can I ask what those were?
Yeah, as I remember them, there was supporting the loyalists in Spain, Russian war relief, some African-American organization, on writing for communist publications. There's a couple of those. As I say, they were all true. You know, I wasn't blacklisted by mistake.
Right. And the implications of being blacklisted, just so people can understand, for how many years were you unemployed as far as, at least officially, as far as film and TV?
I was blacklisted from 50 to 58 in movies, and then another 2 or 3 years in television.
And so I guess the question that comes up then, which you of all people have addressed so well in a movie that you subsequently wrote, but just how did someone, in your case, how did you continue to put food on the table while you were unemployable in the industry that you were qualified for?
Well, first it was by using a pseudonym. Mm-hmm. And then that became untenable because the networks, in this particular case, since I spent the blacklist years in New York, the networks figured out that the writers, being a cunning, unsavory lot, were using, pseudonyms. So they insisted that there be a real person who could go into meetings and they could meet. So it was a question of finding what were called fronts, somebody who would do that for you. And that's how I made my living, by a series different fronts. It was, as I've said, it was easier for the writers than for the actors or directors, because they had to show their face. The writers, if they were lucky, could get away with it.
And you would just find a friend or somebody?
Well, different. You'd find a friend, you'd find somebody who you had to pay a portion of what you made in order to do it for you. You found some embryonic writers who wanted the credits that would come from it. It was different. A friend, again, if you were lucky, it was a friend of mine who was my younger brother's oldest friend, who fronted me for a while and refused to take any money, and so it varied.
So how in 1958 did you wind up getting your your name on a film again? And just for the record, I'm curious. I mean, everybody does talk about Dalton Trumbo being hired for Exodus and Spartacus as the breaking of the blacklist, but that was 2 years after you were, again, in 1958 getting credit. So I just wonder, did writers come earlier? Were you just...
I really don't know, because I didn't know what was going on in Hollywood at all. Mine was, or in film, mine was New York and television. So I didn't know who came first. You got this sense by 58 that it was breaking up, that there were cracks in the blacklist. I think they'd run out of communists, for one thing. Nobody left. And so, as I say, I don't know when Trumbo did that, when he first...
But for you, 1958, how did it come about that you were working again? Who hired you?
Sidney Lumet, my friend. We'd become good friends, and I'd done a lot of work for him in television. He got a job to do a movie for Sophia Loren in New York, and they needed the script. And he recommended me to Carlo Ponti, Sophia's husband, who was also the producer. Ponti didn't know or care anything about the blacklist or who I was. He just took Sidney's word for it. And it was for Paramount Pictures, and they didn't know anything about me either. And they agreed, and I started work on the script. And that's when I found out that there was a subpoena for me. It was the last, I think, HUAC hearing in New York. And it was interesting. Paramount found out first, because the first notice I got, my agent called and said, Paramount isn't going through with this contract they have for you. And I said, why not? He said, there's a subpoena out and you have to go testify. At which point I just packed a bag and went on the lam and continued writing the script. So that's...
And I know that you had two conversations around that time, one with Ponti and one with why Frank Friedman. So I wonder if you could just say, because I think they're both pretty memorable exchanges.
Well, with Ponti, he had been in Italy through most of this, and most of the shooting that had started. And he came back, and I took my lawyer along and met with him and a translator, because he didn't speak English very well at that time, to explain my position if I was forced to testify. And my position was very clear. Well, actually, it was not so clear. I wasn't sure whether I would take the Fifth Amendment or just talk about myself, but I knew I wasn't going to name any names. And I said this, or my lawyer said it, and the translator translated it all into Italian for Carlo, and he rattled back a long string of Italian. The translator said, when he was finished, said to us, Mr. Ponti would like to know who has to be fixed and for how much. He threw up his hands and said, it's politics, it's politics. It's all bullshit to him. I mean, making a movie that was serious. That was important. But politics, you just paid somebody off, and what about your business?
And why Frank Freeman, this Southern gentleman?
Well, I kept, I finished the script, and nothing happened. Well, my memory's a little hazy at this point about the sequence, but United Artists was doing a movie of The Magnificent Seven, a remake of the Japanese movie that Yul Brynner was going to direct. And a very nice guy and good writer named Robert Allen Arthur was going to write the script. And this is for UA. And I knew Arthur. He was not a close friend or anything, we were acquaintances mainly. And he went to Yule and said, look, I know Walter needs a job. He's been blacklisted. And he was quite successful at the time. And he said, I can get a job. And he backed off and let, I got the job. It was a totally selfless thing. It was not political. It was just simply human. And we became good friends after that. But anyway, I started work on that. And at that point, Paramount said, well, he's working, and I got a call from Paramount saying, would I meet with the head of Paramount, why Frank Freeman? And I went to see him, very courtly Southern gentleman, somewhat to the right of John Wayne. I mean, he was really as conservative as you could get. And it was interesting to me because he had on his desk a whole dossier on me, going back to college, everything I had done, everything I had joined, the whole thing. And he said to me, do you mind if we go over those, you tell me whether it's true or not, and how you feel about it today, if it's true. And I said, sure, but at that point, it wasn't that I didn't care, but I'd survived the 8 or 9 years by then, and there wasn't anything worse they could do to me, and I said, sure, I'll do it. And he went down the list, and it was like, this is your life, or something, things that and most of it was true, and I said yes, and some things I would still do, some things I wouldn't, and when I finished, he thanked me. He said, I think you've been honest about this. I will discuss this with someone I talked to about this, who was I forget the man's name, O'Neill, I think who was the head of the American Legion, and get back to you. And 2 weeks later, I got a call saying, okay, you can work. And that was it.
And the world didn't end.
The world didn't end, and another kind of world began for me. Really.
An amazing decade that you had. When I just look at the credits that you or some, even the ones that you weren't credited for over that decade, just to run them off really quickly: Magnificent Seven, Something's Gotta Give, Fail Safe, The Train, The Money Trap, The Molly Maguires. It was a very prolific decade for you.
It was a good decade. I was...
Oscar nomination?
I was lucky in that I had relationships with very good directors, and who became friends, and whom I worked with very happily, and who didn't want to be writers. They were very happy to be directors. And I was very lucky that way, being able to work with Marty Ritt and Michael Ritchie and Sidney Lumet and John Schlesinger and George Cukor. It was wonderful. I was very, very lucky that way.
So things in a odd way came full circle in 1976, when all of a sudden here you are and Martin Ritt, both former Blacklist victims, who decide to make a film about essentially the Blacklist. And can you talk about just what led up to the front, and what that in particular? It must have been a unique experience, more personally.
Well, it was totally personal. And Marty had been blacklisted also, and when we were both cleared and able to work, we always talked about doing a movie about the Blacklist. And what we were interested in doing was a straight dramatic story, really, about somebody who was a communist or communist sympathizer, whether communist probably, and who was blacklisted and how he did it and why he was blacklisted, how he survived it. To tell that story, couldn't get anybody interested in it. Nobody, in those days there wasn't any or much of independent production. It was all studios, and we went around, and Marty had a certain clout, but it didn't help. Nobody was interested in that. And we would talk about it from time to time, to try to resurrect it or think about it. And I forget when it happened, really, but I suddenly got the idea, well, we can't do it straight, let's go at it sideways and tell a story of a front, and tell it as a comedy. And Marty was very resistant to the idea at first. He thought it trivialized the situation. And I pointed out to him there were some pretty good comedies. You know, you had Moliere, you had Shaw, you had some pretty good writers writing serious comedy. And he finally said, okay, all right, let's try it that way. And we took the idea to a man who was the head of Columbia at the time, who'd been our agent. Interesting man named David Beagleman, who ended up forging checks and ultimately killing himself. But we liked him. There was something kind of brassy and he liked doing devious things. And he said, okay, all right. He thought it was interesting, and he put up a derisory amount of money for me to write a first draft script. And I did, and brought it to him, and he said, yeah, I like it, and I'll do it if you get a star. And by star, he meant Warren Beatty or Jack Nicholson or Paul Newman or Robert Redford. And we said, that's not who we want or who should play this part. He said, well, you know, that's how I'll do it if you do it. So we were stuck for a while. And I remember we were playing tennis, Marty and I, and he stopped at one point. He said, what about that kid? You know, and I said, what kid? He said, that funny kid. What about him? I said, who? What are you talking about? He couldn't think of but I said, Mel Brooks. He said, no. I said, oh, Woody Allen, maybe. He said, yeah, that's the funny kid I'm thinking of. So I said, great. You know, I don't know whether they'll do it, but let's send him the script. And we sent Woody the script, and that's what made it possible. He said, yes, you know. He was great, you know. And he said, he came on the set the first day, you know. He said, well, you know, this is your script, I'm here to act. And whatever you want me to do, I'll do. And that's what got it made.
And the ending of that film must have been a little cathartic, right?
Well,
can you just, for people who haven't seen it yet, what's the gist?
Well, the ending of the credits, really,
right.
You know, which came on with, we tried to hire, quite consciously, actors who had been blacklisted, most of whom we knew. I mean, we hired them because we thought they were right for the parts, obviously. And but there were, you know, the main parts were filled with actors, and at the end of the credits, when we listed their names, we listed the years they had been blacklisted. I had been against it, really. I hadn't wanted to do that. I thought it was kind of copping a plea in some kind of way, but everybody thought it was a great idea.
And also, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No.
I was just going to say, Woody Allen basically addresses the committee in a way that I'm sure a lot of people would have liked to.
Yeah, you know, it's a fairy tale.
How just again, if somebody hasn't seen it, what transpires?
Well, at the end, it's a kind of a classic story of you know, a no good bum, basically, who thinks only of himself and wants to get ahead, and is very successful as a front. Everybody thinks that he's the one who did it, you know, and is confronted at the end with a kind of a classic situation. What will he do? You know, the committee calls him up, and they're going to blacklist him, and the network has made a deal with the committee. All he's got to do is name one name, and he's off the hook and he can go back to his privileged, happy life. And the alternative is they have him, that he'll go to jail because he won't answer their questions. And that's the dilemma he has. And at the end, he tries to weasel out of it and can't. And finally, he has to take a stand. And he tells them to go fuck themselves. Which we never thought we would get past, the studio or the censors, but we did, and it's a very satisfying end. Really, gets a big cheer from the audience when it happens. At least the times I've seen it. It was our movie. I mean, it was our revenge in a way. We were saying, we're still here. You didn't, and it was a very, very satisfying experience.
My last two things are very brief, and I just have to ask you, years after the fact, or after you first joined the Communist Party, when there were certain things that came out about gulags and other things that people didn't really know about early on, did it lead you to reconsider your views, or did you feel that in the end you're still, how would you describe your feelings?
I left the Communist Party in '56. After Hungary was the final thing, other things that started to come out that bothered me. And I stopped being a communist in that sense. I never stopped being some kind of Marxist, some kind of leftist, some kind of, I believe in democratic socialism. I haven't seen it yet, but I still believe in it. And the things that made me a communist or brought me into the Communist Party, I still believe in it. I'm of the left. I will remain somebody of the left. I haven't found any organization that represents what I believe in. But that's who I am, and that's that vision that of a society. I mean, the people. There are the people who run the world, and there are people who make the world run. I mean, take your choice about which one of those you believe in and want to be part of.
And finally, here we are 65 years after this all started, and you had a rich and wonderful career and life in the years that followed, but does a part of you ever wonder what life might have been like if you had never been, or how it might be different if you had never been blacklisted? And do you have any regrets about the way things were handled, or are you pretty pleased with the way?
I'm not pleased with having been blacklisted any more than I'm pleased that 4.5 years of my life was spent in the army, getting shot at part of the time. But it was no, I'm not. I believed in something. I was blacklisted for it. I still believe in it. You believe in something, or you act on it, you take the consequences. That's, and I would do it again. I wasn't happy about it, and yet, it was a very important, necessary part of my life. And I don't regret it.
Well, thank you so much.
Like Edith Piaf.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was wonderful. I really appreciate it.
Okay.